Hello, Team Anastasis. Today I am with Andrea Pittman, who is the director of the Nectar Group, who we partner with. And Andrea, just give us a little bit of background about the Nectar Group and how it got started and what you all do.
Yeah. Well, as Kelly said, I'm Andrea Pittman. I'm the executive director and founder at the Nectar Group. And the Nectar Group has been around for about 8 years. We are a cognitive training and education center based in Greenwood Village, Colorado. And my background actually was in the classroom. I was a teacher. I taught 6th through 12th grade. And I really became curious about what causes some children to be more successful learners than others, to have greater ease with learning, to enjoy learning. And then you have another kiddo in the same system, the same education, and they are struggling. And I wanted to go understand what was actually happening biologically and structurally in the brain that made, one person be able to read with great fluency and one not. And so I left the classroom to pursue a career in the field of neuroscience. And that was 20 years ago. And so since then, my passion has been really bridging the gap between neuroscience and education. And so we have all these great neuroscientists to learn all kinds of fascinating information about how the brain works and how learners acquire information, retain it, utilize it for later. But that typically gets written up in a white paper that goes into a science journal that other scientists read, and it never makes it over to education. And so through the Nectar Group, we're really passionate about partnering with schools who are like-minded and wanting to really meet learners where they're at, and provide great resources, data, and even treatments for helping provide resources and services that actually can treat the underlying causes of learning difficulties.
And we have so appreciated the research-based. What we find is so often in education, there's this great research, there's this great theory behind everything that's kind of happening at a very high level, and it never really reaches the practical application.
Right.
And so what I love about what Nectar is doing is the partnership between schools and yourself, in really bridging that gap and giving kind of that practical application and knowledge of what do we do when we know what's going on neurologically with a child, and how does that impact kind of what is happening in the classroom. And that more information is always great for teachers, because you're not playing the guessing game of just asking the questions you were asking as a teacher of why is one student successful and one really struggling mightily, and how do we kind of bridge that gap. So we so appreciate that you do that. And we've been partnered for 5 years now, or headed into our 5th year, I guess. Can you talk a little bit about what the partnership with the school looks like and what it is you do during a screening?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few different components to how we partner with schools, in your school in particular. And so in some of those that parents and children see and experience firsthand, and some that happen that you get the benefits of, but maybe you might not know about, that are behind the scenes. So on one hand, our goal is to really support the teaching team in terms of just being a resource, providing additional insight and information. In a smaller school especially, there's not going to be, a clinical psychologist on staff. There's not a clinical psychologist staff on big schools either. Yeah. We have a clinical psychologist on staff, a neuropsychologist, a team of special educators, educational consultants. And so we're able to provide some additional insight or answer questions. We love it when we get calls from teachers and they're like, hey, I've got this kiddo and I'm trying to problem solve this, and here's some of the variables. Can you give me any suggestions? And so that's a way that we support schools. And the more information we have about those students, then we're able to provide that great insight back to teachers so that they can better meet the needs of students in their classroom. We also provide some ongoing training and development at key times throughout the years. Over the years, we've done some different workshops and trainings, from like building a brain-friendly classroom and those types of insights that can actually just enhance what teachers are already doing. We also provide then assessment from this perspective of really understanding how is each student's brain working and functioning. We look at the screener that we do, that your children will be doing, is a cognitive screen. And that looks at the underlying skills that make up how they learn and process information. It's not what they know, it's how they acquire what they know. And so we're looking at things like their processing speed. That's like your brain's internet speed. It's how quickly you can take in information, move it around, access it, etc. We also look at things like memory and their visual processing and auditory processing. All of these elements determine a lot of the way that a student shows up in class and where they need additional support and where they can really soar and go and move forward independently. And so we provide this screening that we do annually for the school for all students. And then this goes to the teachers and to the leadership team at the school so that they can have this additional insight. We then provide resources to the teachers about, for example, if you have a student in your class that has lower auditory processing, what are some of the ways that you can adapt to better meet their needs? And then the last area is that we actually do provide our therapeutic interventions and our services. So we provide cognitive training, which is a therapy that actually treats any deficits in those skill areas. We also provide tutoring and academic support if a student needs to have a bit beyond what's going on in the classroom, especially if there's like an underlying learning disability. And then we also provide things like executive function coaching, study skills, preparation for high school and beyond, college prep, those things as well. And so we have that ability to then provide those services for families at the school in terms of being able to give them access to those services.
Yeah, a lot of smaller schools, a lot of private schools don't have access to some of those services that maybe public schools may have more access. I think the difference in the partnership that we have that I haven't seen in any school is really, again, that practical use of what's coming out. And I think a lot of times it's hard for families to distinguish the difference between really what is a cognitive screening versus, you know, your traditional assessment that's looking at what students know. And like you said, this is really the underlying, like, what is powering kids to be able to acquire knowledge. And that's so often missing in any types of screenings in schools, especially on a wide basis where every student is getting that. Maybe the kids who are really struggling in school start to get some of those screenings, but from a standpoint of knowing that information about every student, I've never been in another school where that was true. And from an educator perspective, you know, it's somewhat helpful to know, you know, where they fall in the standards and their skill, you know, their acquisition of skills and content knowledge is helpful for a teacher. But when you're not sure what's actually happening that's causing either that really easy acquisition of skills or a struggle in acquisition of skills, you can feel really kind of like your hands are tied behind your back. So I so appreciate that what we get out of the Nectar assessment is really an understanding of why the content and acquisition of skills might look like it does. And that just isn't information that educators get a lot of times.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've been an educational consultant for schools all over the country, and I've worked in 38 different states with different schools of all different sizes. And I don't have a single other school that every child has that and that every teacher has that for every student in their classroom. And so it is, you know, one of the ways we describe this assessment is think of your brain as kind of like a computer. And so we have our computer processor and then we have our database. So we have like the information that's stored on the computer, and then we have actually how the computer works. And so the cognitive screening is looking at how the computer works. It's looking at your brain's processor versus most school testing, certainly like state standardized tests, is going to be just looking at what's in your database. It's looking at how much, you know, how many math facts do you have stored? How many facts do you have? What knowledge do you have in there versus actually understanding the inner workings of what's the health of the processor. Wow. And that is so important for, it's so empowering for teachers. I mean, we do a lot of training for teachers, and their first thing is always like, oh my gosh, how could I ever teach without this information now that I know this? Because it really helps you understand where you might feel like you're kind of beating your head against the wall. And so is the student, that when we can have that insight, it better meets their needs. And it's also super helpful for parents to understand this. Wow. I have parents tell me all the time, oh my gosh, I've been so frustrated with my child. We've been, you know, having tears, slammed doors, you know, all the stuff that's so stressful at home because they haven't been able to do X, Y, or Z. And we actually, now that you understand, oh, they have really low auditory processing, they can't take in verbal instruction in multiple steps. They're missing that. And now it can help you as a parent be empowered to actually have greater success in your communication with your child at home too. And so I think that there's a, really great benefit to knowing this information. If it were up to me, every child would have this, just like they have their annual physicals with their doctor. They should have, you think about, I had one mom once, she said, gosh, we check our eyes, we check our teeth, we, check our bodies, but we don't check our brains every year. Like, that's kind of crazy to think about. So.
Yes, it totally is. And we so appreciate that we get that like a physical every year. So every year we start with this knowledge as part of our just understanding of who a child is and how they're coming to us as part of our learner profile. And that, just as you're saying, has been so powerful for our teachers, for our team, as we're kind of building lessons and curriculum and experiences in a classroom that is brain friendly, that is meeting their needs where they are. Andrea, at what point do you kind of see scores where, I know every one of us could benefit really from your services, but what's kind of the pain point where it goes from, the school can really handle all of this to we need additional support, and how do you communicate that with families?
Yeah, absolutely. So to answer that, let me give you just a little bit more information about how the screen logistically works for any families who haven't been screened before. So what typically happens is after your child will have a screening, and then you will also schedule a consultation where we go over the test results, and I walk you through those in detail, answer questions. We talk about suggestions for ways you can support any areas that have need for development at home, whether that might be specific board games or activities, or just even what extracurriculars might help support that. Certainly, if we see a red flag for something that's outside of the scope of what the school or we do, we can give you referrals. For example, we might come across a child who could benefit from a speech evaluation. Well, we're not speech therapists on either side, so we would refer you out to some resources for that. We may also then refer you to some additional, more comprehensive or diagnostic testing if there are some red flags that are consistent with what we're seeing from multiple data points. So the test is a test is always one data point on one moment in time. And so we're also looking at how does that data, is it consistent with the rest of the data that we see from past school performance, from things at home, et cetera. So we'll talk about all of that. And if we see symptomatology, meaning like if we see issues where you're going, man, we see this at home, we see this at school, we see this in extracurriculars, and the testing data supports that there is something going on here, then I would be making a recommendation most often for a more comprehensive assessment. So this is what we call a screener. It is extensive. It's about an hour and 15 minutes, and it looks very thoroughly. It's actually the same screener that Children's Hospital uses. It's something that's nationally used and very well respected in the psychological and neuroscience and education fields. But we can look deeper to really pinpoint, okay, what is actually going on? Is there something significant enough that warrants testing? As a general rule, that would be recommended for any areas that are below the 30th percentile. So that score is where we start to get to see more significant impact to actual performance and success. But that said, that doesn't mean, like, there could be reasons why something was at a 30th percentile. Let's say a kiddo was sick when they took the test. Now, we hopefully aren't testing them when they're sick, but there could be variables such as that we want to look at the whole picture. We also have some times where a child is not 50th percentile on this test would be average, but we might see someone that's like 45th percentile, and that's not that far below average, but for them, it's affecting them significantly. So it's not just an actual number, which is why we don't just give you the test scores. We want to meet with you to discuss them, because there are multiple variables, and it's not one score by itself that dictates if there's a problem or not. It's part of a whole picture. And so we might have a situation where even, for example, we have a student we worked with recently that was, most of their skills were very advanced in the 90+ percentile range. So that's high for anyone. They're in the top 10% of children for their age for those particular skills. They had one skill that was at 60th percentile. that is not diagnostically a problem. That's still above average. But for this child, it was causing them a lot of problems because for them, it was a really big deficit for them. And so again, we're looking at that whole picture and the child holistically themselves as well.
Yeah, that was really eye-opening to me working with you.
Mm-hmm.
Is so often in education we're kind of looking at like bottom line, and a lot of times it's the discrepancy between
Yes.
different things that's causing kids a lot of problems, or is just really impacting them in significant ways that just from a quick glance you wouldn't necessarily pick up on. So
Right.
I do so appreciate the time that you spend helping families really understand what that diagnostic is showing them and what it all means, how that might play out in family life and school life. And a lot of those things that, you've seen in school maybe over the years that you're scratching your head and going, I know they're so bright, but they really are struggling and I don't know why. That it starts to shine some light on those areas of where is the struggle kind of originating from. So we so appreciate that at Anastasis, and just having that additional insight is so helpful. But I know that that's really powerful for families as well.
Absolutely. And it's so fun to see. I mean, my appreciation is just in terms of the team at the school, how much they embrace this information and really truly have the best interest for each student as an individual at heart. And that's in not just at heart, but at action too. I see really these in the phone calls we get, and taking their own time and sending an email after school to say, hey, I know this student had this score and this is a problem we're seeing in the classroom that I'm working with them on. Can you elaborate on the connection? Can you help? Is there any suggestions you have? And then certainly when we're actually providing services to a student where we're actually doing some therapeutic intervention, then we even have greater insight into the student and can enhance, open that communication to an even greater degree because we just know more intimately the student.
I find that partnership between you all, our teachers, our staff at Anastasis, and parents, when we're kind of all working together in tandem, is so incredibly powerful. I don't know of another school scenario that really does have that partnership in that way, that really kind of boosts, what do we have going on here and how do we best serve these kids? And to have it mirrored, at home, at school, and then if they are involved in additional therapies, to have it mirrored there as well is pretty incredible.
Right,
so what happens after the screening? What does the screening look like? Maybe let's start there and then talk about what happens after the screening.
Yeah, perfect. So what's going to happen is you will actually receive in the mail a packet that is just some testing sheets that your child will write on. Some of this assessment is done orally, some is done through them seeing some information and pointing or telling us information back, but there are a few parts that are written. So we actually mail you, snail mail, a packet that you get with the testing sheets, because this test will be done over video conferencing. So you will get information from our team, exactly what to do, what to expect, very detailed instructions. And then we will you'll sign up online. You'll get a sign up sheet that you'll have a link to sign up online for your child's slot. We actually have done this. Some of you, depending on how long you've been at the school, may have done it where we did it in the flesh, in person. But we've actually also, long before COVID, we work with schools all over. And so we've been doing this way remotely for about 8 years since our inception. And we actually see some pros to doing this in the home setting in terms of accuracy of the testing and a student being in a comfortable environment. But we want to set it up optimally. So we'll help you with that piece. And then on test day, your child will be independent working with us. It is with the person the whole time. It's not like they're taking an online test. It's through video conferencing with a person the entire time, one of our psychometrists. So the people testing your child will be a master's degree neuropsychologist or psychologist, and they're what are called psychometrists. That means they're psychologists who specialize in testing. And they will take your child through a series of activities activities. It's not going to feel like a state standardized test or something. There's no Scantron and bubble sheets or anything like that. It's much more interactive and engage the students engage the entire time. Once the testing is done, we'll give you some instructions that you're going to take a couple pictures and scan them in or email or text them to us. It's super simple. We have a couple of options just depending on where you have technology wise, because we'll need the testing sheets back to score them. All that data from the test gets put into a national database where we're able to then generate the actual scores. And then those will be produced into a report, and you'll sign up for a meeting to meet with me or our other center director, Danny. And one of us will meet with you to go over those test results. And then those will also be provided to the school and the team there. And then we provide additional information and support with the school in terms of teachers being really comfortable with the data, the outcomes, all of those kinds of things. And so it will be that, here's the screening, and then there is the results, and then that communication with the school. We don't communicate the results to students in any way unless that's something we've discussed to do. And again, it's not like it's a grade. It's not like you get a pass fail. It's not a placement. It's us understanding how their brain works. And that goes into part of the overall larger, as one piece of the overall building of a learner profile for the staff at Anastasis.
Yeah. I so appreciate the distinction, because I know for a lot of kids, they can have a lot of anxiety around testing, particularly maybe after the last year. There's been so much pressure, and kind of what might learning loss have looked like, and how have different things just played out. And so really that distinction for kids, and a lot of times parents, we call that just a screener. You're going to do a screener. It's just part of getting ready for school. There is no pressure. This is not stressful. As Andrea mentioned, this is not your typical like bubble Scantron. It feels more like an interactive, almost games than anything else.
Absolutely.
So very low stress, low anxiety, low stakes. We're really just looking at how does your brain work and understanding that a little bit better. And so a lot of times just framing it that way for kids is really helpful. So there's not the anxiety around, oh no, I have to take a test, and I'm being judged on something, and what does that look like?
Absolutely.
That's a great point. I'm glad you said something about it.
And there's nothing they can prepare for. Sometimes parents call and say, like, do we need to refresh on anything or study? Or no, this is literally like how your brain is wired. So we're going to look at like how you can solve 3-dimensional puzzles in the 2D realm, so we can see your spatial skills. We're going to look at some critical thinking and problem solving questions where you're having to follow a stream of logic and make sense of it, and those kinds of things. So it's nothing you really can prepare for, nor would you want to, because it would kind of skew the results. So yeah, when we're talking to students, we're not talking a lot about testing or those things, because there can be a negative connotation around that for sure, for all of us. But it's a much more experiential and interactive. And most kids, when they're done, will say, that was really fun. Sometimes they will say like, oh, that was really hard. And one thing to know about this test that I think is helpful is we want to see, we're not testing based on, oh, they should only get these questions because they're in 3rd grade or 5th grade. We want to see what their maximum capacity is. And so the way you test this is you keep giving questions until they miss a certain number. So you have to miss 6 questions. So that way, if we have a 3rd grader and they're able to work all the way through the 6th grade material, we can see that. On the flip side, we'll keep backing up. So if we start them at 3rd grade level, but it's too hard, we're going to keep going back until we find the sweet spot for them. And so sometimes students will be like, oh, at the end, it was really hard. And that's just because they got to higher levels. They hit their maximum capacity. So that's something kind of helpful, I think, for parents to know. So if your child's giving you some feedback about it, you understand a little bit what's going on, because we can't tell them that, or it could skew the test. But that's helpful for you to know what's happening with it.
That is a really great distinction as well. Yeah. And then last question for you, Andrea. I know as teachers, we see the kids go through this process and we're like, I wonder what that looks like for me. I wonder if that knowledge had been useful for me going through school. And I know a lot of adults are also curious about, how am I processing? Do you do this process with adults? And if so, kind of what does that look like? How do parents start to uncover that for themselves if it's something they're interested in?
Absolutely. So we do work with our youngest children. We work with our 4, and our oldest client right now is 74. So we get to work with the full lifespan. And it's pretty empowering for adults. We have adults that utilize this type of intervention or even an assessment for themselves as part of like their professional development through their job. Sometimes, if you were lucky enough to work at a company that provides like finances for professional development, it's a really popular thing we have for our parents of our kids if they have that to utilize that. So you can always assess your function. I think it's also helpful for you to firsthand experience it. If your child is doing it, you can relate to it. And it also kind of normalizes it that, hey, like we can all make our brains better at any point in life. And leading by example with that for our children is such a powerful thing to do. So we always offer complimentary screens for families. And even if you have a child that's in a different school, if I know we're talking about adults, but if you have siblings that aren't at the same school, we're always happy to screen them. And then we do provide discounted full assessments for adults as well, for our families that are at our partner schools. So if you have an interest for yourself, we can always explore that with you and see how you can optimize your brain too. So
that's awesome. Yeah, I know for me, I see the kids' results, and I'm always just so curious. And I know a lot of our parents have been as well, and some have taken advantage of that. So I like to mention it. One last thing that I just so appreciate about the work that you all do is no matter what the scores look like that come out, your messaging to adults, to kids, and it's true, is that we can all make change. And you mentioned that a little bit ago, that our brains are not fixed, that they're there's great plasticity, and we can continue learning and growing and actually making connections in our brain that help us for a whole life. So it's not something you just do when you're young or when you're old, and low scores don't necessarily mean something bad. It just gives us more information about kind of what underlying things are we working with, so that we know, what inputs might help us grow in really important and meaningful ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to echo that, I always say God's greatest gift to us, one of his greatest gifts to us among many, is neuroplasticity. And that's that our brains, as you just said, Kelly, are not fixed, that we have this ability to change our brains. We're not stuck with what we're born with. And my favorite part of my job is that I get to give people hope for where they may have thought that this is an issue that for their whole life, their child's whole life, they're going to have to struggle or they're going to have to work around. And in the 20 years I've been doing this work, every year we just learn more about how our brains are so capable of rewiring and overcoming learning challenges. It doesn't have to be something you struggle with or that limits you forever. Now, we don't have a cure for every single thing. I wish we did, but you can make almost everything radically better if you can't cure it. And so, and there's a lot of capacity there for improvement, which is great news for all of us. So it's my favorite part of what I get to do is being able to communicate to people that this is not as good as it gets, that these things that are limiting you and holding you back in your life can be overcome.
Yes, I so appreciate that. And I think the kids really take that message to heart as well, that they can continue learning, growing, that to me, that's so empowering, where a lot of schools, you might get that messaging of I'm not enough because your test scores don't reflect it or whatever it might be. And that's just the end point, because there is no looking at what is going on and then empowering students where they are. So I love that messaging gets through to students as well, that they can start to see like, oh, there are things that I can do to continue growing all my life and to continue making myself better. And that just is empowering for all of us. So
that's perfect.
I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Well, Andrea, thank you. We will be sending out materials to our families shortly with some more information. But I appreciate you just taking the time to share with exactly what this process looks like and why we're doing it. And I really appreciate that.
Well, absolutely. Well, it's a blessing for us to work with all of the families at Anastasis. It feels like another home for us in terms of just, I love the community. And so if you're new to the community, we look forward to being part of the welcoming committee to you. And if you've been here for a while, we're looking forward to meeting with you again to follow up on how your children are doing. So please don't be shy. You'll have my information in what gets sent out, and feel free if you have any questions at all, I'm happy to discuss. So always feel comfortable reaching out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.